The risk assessment process is key to 27001, as this, for all intents and purposes, is a risk framework. If your organization doesn't already have a risk assessment process defined, you will need to help define it as part of the prep process. We'll be focused on developing Doc A8.2 risk management as part of this. The workflow I will be covering for this module is just one of the many ways of doing it. What you'll quickly realize as you start down the process of certification is a good chunk of your time will be around risk assessing your assets, assessing your supplies, assessing your processes, and so on. Now, as I mentioned before, if your company already has a methodology in place, use it. Don't reinvent the wheel here. If not, we need to select a methodology to follow, and there are two ways of thinking through this: quantitative or qualitative. In a quantitative assessment, we are going to identify the assets, then analyze the threats and vulnerabilities of that asset and assign costs associated with that threat becoming real. If a laptop is stolen, it will cost $800 to replace. Then, based on actual data you may have or assumed computations, we figure out the cost per year. We then take that number and compare it to the cost of mitigation. That will give us the information we need to decide whether this is a risk we accept or treat. Now, looking at the table, if we research upgrading electrical fuses and installing a UPS to clean the line for $30,000, is it worth the effort, especially considering the initial server fail was only assessed to cost $2,500 every 5 years or $500 per year? The other way of assessing risks is through a qualitative methodology. This is a process of understanding the threats and developing a criteria of calculating the impact that vulnerability has on the business and how likely it is to occur. Then, based on the risk acceptance criteria, you determine what risks need to be mitigated and which can be accepted. Quantitative is based on financials, qualitative is based on severity. Back to the old adage of don't reinvent the wheel, there are a bunch of documented frameworks available today to help navigate the risk assessment process. The ISO family of risk assessments, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, or the Octave variations, plus many more. My advice, before you conduct a risk assessment, is to talk to your people to identify highest known risks, DBAs, engineers, security-minded folk in the organization. Get an idea of where the low-hanging fruit reside and start digging a little there. The clause 6.1.2 dives into 4 key areas required of the risk assessment. You need to set a criteria for when to perform and what is acceptable. Make sure the process is repeatable. Identify the risk to confidentiality, availability, and integrity and the associated risk owner. And finally, the criteria for assessing impact to the CIA along with the likelihood of it happening. And let's talk through each of these a little. Regardless of methodology, qualitative or quantitative, your organization want to draw a line in the sand and say, this is our acceptable risk appetite. Now we will dig into this a little bit more in detail later, but basically set that boundary of what is acceptable and what isn't. Then once you have identified risks outside that boundary, work to move everything back into acceptable range through controls and mitigation. The process should be repeatable so that no matter who performs the risk assessment process, the steps to conduct and the outcome will be comparable. You want risks to be defined by the assessment process, not how well the assessor paid attention to the training. The risk assessment process should take into account the impact of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the big 3 of information security. And that risk should be assigned to a risk owner, someone in the business who is responsible for mitigating the risk and reviewing the assessment regularly to understand the threats and vulnerabilities of the asset or supplier or process. Those CIA calculations is what makes up the impact we are trying to mitigate against and perceived likelihood of it happening. What is the impact on financials, reputation, or regulatory requirements? This can be graded however you see fit, high, medium, and low, or a drawn-out number and scale, or a quick and easy grading scale. Again, is all up to you and what you feel meets the business maturity.